I guess it's good afternoon. I'm David Klaus, the Consulting Director of the Wilson Center on the Hill program. I'd like to welcome you here on behalf of the Wilson Center, and also John Sewell, who is one of our policy scholars at the Wilson Center. Brief introduction. The Wilson Center was established in 1968 as a living memorial to former President Woodrow Wilson. President Wilson was the only president that has a PhD and was formerly the president of Princeton University. And Congress saw fit in 1968, rather than build some large structure that people would visit, they decided to create a living memorial in the form of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. We have about 130 scholars a year that come and do serious work from around the world and around the country on policy, on the intersection between, if you will, the academic world and the think tank world and public policy. So Wilson Center on the Hill was established about a year ago to help bring the expertise and ideas and things that go on at the Wilson Center to the congressional audience. So we thank you for coming. A couple housekeeping details, if I can. I hope you've all signed up or given us a business card. There's two reasons to sign up. One is that it helps us know who's coming and how many people are coming. And secondly, if in the future you sign up and do an RSVP, then it's not always the case that we're able to let everybody who's outside in the hall come in the room. We had a tremendous response to this program, and RSVPs obviously get priority. So please send us please, if you've not done so already, give us your business card, and that way you'll receive email notice of our programs. Second little housekeeping detail. I know there was a long line for lunch. If during the course of this program you want to quietly get up and get a sandwich and get a lunch, please feel free to do so. And if you want to get cookies, please feel free to do so. That's considered one of the basic food groups. Let me share with you just a quick announcement of upcoming programs. On July 7th, we're going to have a program on pensions. I think sort of the short question is, what is the federal government and what is public policy going to do now that everyone's 401k is a 201k? And that's not the official title for this program, although it's a contender. On July 16th, we're going to have a program on international education. Some of you many people are not aware of this, but the OECD runs something called the Pisa Program, the Pisa testing program, and around the world, I guess on about a semi-annual, every other year, they subject a bunch of 15-year-olds in 40 different countries to tests of science and math capability. And it's done in a way that provides a real useful sort of markers between all the 40 countries, including the United States, about what's going on in education. And then they do all sorts of information and background to help you figure out why it is that the results turn out the way they do. The United States ranks 20th. In terms of high school education and math problem solving. So on the 16th, we're going to have a program with the head of the Pisa program and other people who will help look at what's going on and what the U.S. can do about it. We have a program on July 28th that is going to take two experts on and they're going to be on two countries, North Korea and Iran, both of which are real foreign policy challenges for the United States. And the nuclear issue is very much in play for both. And so we're going to try and focus on what does the United States do now that the whole question about atomic weapons are on the table, or certainly are concerns as we try and negotiate with countries that are not necessarily on the same page that we are in all respects. And then I'll do very quickly, if you put in the fall, we have two very interesting programs coming up. We actually just are coordinating an agreement. I don't know if some of you may have seen in the Post on Sunday a review of a really interesting new book in which that analyzes how do people who live on $2 a day actually live on $2 a day. And they gave basically financial diaries to people who live on $2 a day around the world. The authors of that book are going to come and do a program here on Capitol Hill and try and help people understand exactly how that works. I would think that would be of a fair amount of interest to a group that's interested in the development programs that are here. We also have a program coming up on immigration. So that's a pretty healthy set of things going forward. As I said, we encourage you to sign up and let us know as much as you can in advance when you're coming. Now, I've taken longer than I thought I would. With that, let me introduce John Sewell, who will be the moderator as one of the scholars at the Wilson Center, and turn the program over to him. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, David. I assume that on your $2 a day session that the lunch will reflect that.
You know, we threaten that sometimes.
I want to welcome you all here. I'm John Sewell. I'm a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I was asked to moderate today's discussion of foreign aid reform. We have two long, skilled experts who are going to talk after I make a few remarks. One is Diana Olbaum, who's senior advisor to Congressman Berman, chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And one is Ray Offenhauser, who's president of Oxfam America. Oxfam, as most of you know, is one of the most creative non-governmental organizations that carry out development all over the world, in this case, both in this country and abroad. I simply want to start off with a few brief remarks to sort of set the stage for the discussion, because this is a rather interesting point. The last time the Foreign Aid Bill, the Foreign Assistance Act, was totally rewritten was in 1961, and I guess looking around, there are only a few of us here who were around at that time. But that's before Vietnam, in the midst of the Cold War. But as everybody here knows, we live in a totally different world than in 1961. We live in a globalized society linked together economically, politically, and even socially, and yet we still have an aid program designed for that much earlier era. The remarkable point now is, for the first time in many years, the issue of what kind of aid program and development program the U.S. should have to promote its own national interests is very much on the table. Congress is very interested in the issue and even in rewriting the foreign assistance legislation. Outside groups involved in concern about these issues have done a number of good studies. They're actively engaged thinking about the issue, and even the administration, I think, is interested in this issue and is working on it at this moment. For that reason, in terms of the discussion that we'll have after our two panelists talk for equally few brief minutes, that it would be useful to lay out 5 brief criteria against which any proposal, whether it's coming from Congress or the administration or elsewhere, it can be judged. So let me do that very quickly, just to give you a framework when you think about these issues in your work. First of all, it's crucial that whatever proposal it is lays out a strategy, lays out a framework for what I will call a national development strategy. That is some government-wide document that sets out clear goals and objectives for U.S. development policy rather than just organizational tinkering. Now, on the table outside is a piece done by a group convened at the Wilson Center a year ago for both candidates called A Letter to the President. If you're interested in what should go into a national development strategy, not substantively, but in terms of structure, it's laid out in very brief form there. So that's the first criteria. Second criteria, does this proposal, whatever proposal it is, encompass the multiple parts of the U.S. government that are engaged in promoting development? As we speak, there are now 12 U.S. government departments, 25 U.S. government agencies, and nearly 60 U.S. government offices that are engaged in one form or another of promoting development overseas, health, education, and all sorts of other issues. That's obviously no way to run a government, and there's general agreement that the system is broke and needs to be changed, and all of those entities need to be taken into account. The third criteria is, do they take account of the changes that have taken place in what I will call, for shorthand, the development business? This is not 1961, when the U.S. was the dominant donor and thinker about development. We're no longer that. We're only the major provider of aid funds in only a few countries. China is the major provider to countries in Southeast Asia, as is India. And in Africa, it's the EU and the World Bank and other agencies. Furthermore, there are many more non-governmental funders, very serious ones. Gates Foundation spends over $1 billion on dealing with HIV, AIDS, and other diseases. Ford and other U.S. foundations are helping to rebuild African universities. Companies like Mars, if you've got a Snickers in your pocket, and FedEx are running their own technical assistance programs, whether it's to improve the quality of cocoa they want to buy or to get to improve customs services so that packages get in and out of countries very quickly. So there are a huge number of players that have to be brought into the business outside the U.S. government. The fourth, and next to last, is do the proposals that are put forth reflect what has been learned over the last 5 decades of promoting development? We have learned a lot. For instance, we do know that no outsider, that is, whether you're in a foundation or an NGO or in the U.S. government, no outsider develops a country. Only be done by effective governments and full participation of people in those countries. And every country that has succeeded to grow rapidly and to eliminate poverty has done it in their own distinct way. The outsider can help. The outsider can be a very important part of it, but the country has to lead. And fifth and finally, important in our form of government, is do the proposals reflect strong presidential and administration endorsement, making it clear that all the other agencies of the government are to cooperate whether they like it or not. If not, the proposals are likely to fail. And it's worth remembering that all previous attempts at reforming, at large-scale development reform, have foundered because the executive refused to take congressional or other initiatives seriously. So it's against those criteria you want to think about as people put proposals on the table. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn to Ray Offenhauser to speak about his experience. Yeah, whichever way you want. You can talk from down there if you want.
Well, thanks very much, John. And I want to just pick up where John left off in terms of, can everyone hear me all right? Great. Basically talking about the fact that we start with the notion that we've got a system that has had considerable accomplishments over the last 30, 40, 50 years, but is fundamentally broken, and that we're in need of a substantial reform process. We've made over the last decade short-term fixes and taken piecemeal approaches, but I think the good news is we finally have leadership in a reform process that is attempting to address really some of the long-term and complex issues that will enable us to really grapple with what it means today to do development in a 21st century context. And I think that's really the challenge that we've all got to embrace and we've all got to get behind. In the House, Chairman Berman has introduced House Bill 2139, which would create a national strategy for global development. And he's begun a process in the Foreign Affairs Committee of bringing forward a broader reform bill later this year, which I think is going to really be, if we're successful, the successor to the 1961 legislation. And I'd say it's long overdue and it's extraordinarily needed. Extraordinarily important and necessary that this happen at this particular time. And on the Senate side, Chairman Kerry and Senator Lugar have also been leading a reform process with the same sort of spirit and interest in this reform. And recently, I think in May, Chairman Kerry actually, in a speech I think at Brookings, declared his intent to reform the U.S. Foreign Assistance Program. And we're expecting to learn more about his interests in that process going forward. But I think it's fair for us, as we're thinking about what we mean by development, to recognize that real impact, which is what we all care about, in development outcomes and for the poor, who are really, at the end of the day, the intended beneficiaries of this process, will depend not just on our reorganizing authorities and increasing budgets here in Washington, but also on how we're going to define our core objectives, what it is we're after, our end game, and how we define success. That's really the critical strategic set of questions we've all got to be asking ourselves. I want to actually take a little bit of a sidestep here for a moment and draw on some of my own years of field experience in the development field and that of Oxfam, which works in some 120 countries around the world, and just share a few brief perspectives on how we might get to an effective agenda for fighting global poverty, picking up a little bit on John's themes about what we've learned and what we need to do to move this agenda forward. My purpose in doing this is not just to illustrate some core strategic principles, but also to suggest what we need to be thinking about as we jumpstart this process. Oftentimes what gets lost in our development debate is an appreciation of the fact that it is a long-term process. It's not something not an issue we can resolve in a day. We've got to take a long-term perspective. And so in that spirit, I want to actually take you back to 1971. It's 1971, and it's Bangladesh. and there's a war. It's either some refer to it as the Indian-Pakistan War, or some others would refer to it as the Bangladesh Liberation War. What we had there was East Pakistan separating from West Pakistan. We had a newly independent state. We had 2.5 million refugees in India. We had 2.3 million people killed in Bangladesh. We had massive internal displaced population, no government, and rebuilding from scratch. And 3 years of subsequent massive famines, that some of which was memorialized in George Harrison's famous song about Bangladesh. 1973, Henry Kissinger describes Bangladesh as the world's basket case. This sounds in many ways familiar. It could be southern Sudan today, but remember again, Bangladesh was East Pakistan in 1971. And it's important to think about what I'm about to tell you in light of what is going on in Pakistan today. So let's fast forward to the present. What does Bangladesh look like today? We don't hear about famines in Bangladesh today, and we don't hear about them. Why? Well, USAID built domestic institutions in Bangladesh to deal with long-term national food security needs. It built a National Agricultural Research Service. It built the Bangladesh Institute for Rice Research that collaborated with the Consultative Group on International Agriculture during the Green Revolution and improved and got high-yielding rice varieties introduced into Bangladesh. It supported, Texas Tech supported the Ag University in Bangladesh over many decades. A success story. Population. Bangladesh has the densest population on Earth. We could put the entire world's population in the continental United States. That's the density of Bangladesh today. But interesting story is that fertility rates in Bangladesh have dropped dramatically, and they've done so in a context that defy all the sort of basic principles of demography, which basically say you've got to dramatically increase income if fertility rates are going to drop. Well, today, Bangladesh fertility rates are 2.5. Pakistan's are 3.2. That is an extraordinary achievement in the population field, and we don't talk about it. And I think the important thing to recognize is USAID built large and innovative capacity in government and the NGO sector, in family planning and maternal child health care. That's how this happened. Jesse Helms was an enormous fan of this program and touted it often. Bangladesh today has the largest, most innovative NGO sector in the world. Grameen Bank and the Bangladesh Rural Advancement Committee, BRAC, are the two largest NGOs in the world. And we all know that Yunus won the Nobel Prize. Bangladesh leads the world in programs in microfinance and maternal child health. Now they're exporting their programs to other countries. And now, interestingly enough, after 6 years, BRAC, or the Bangladesh Rural Advancement Committee, is now one of the largest NGOs in Afghanistan, providing South-South technical assistance to Afghani NGOs for a fraction, I might add, of what it costs to send in U.S. consultants. Monumental bang for the buck for development organizations interested in doing South-South technical assistance. Again, why did this happen? USAID and others, bilateral investors from Europe, invested heavily in building the not-for-profit sector in Bangladesh with all of what it's achieved today. I think it's important to remember this contrast with Pakistan. They're both large Muslim nations. They're critical to U.S. interests. Yet recent research that was done by our host, the Wilson Center, its Asia program, shows that while both Pakistan and Bangladesh face enormous challenges in terms of poverty, economic growth, and governance, Bangladesh has actually managed to outperform Pakistan on a number of key social indicators: fertility, per capita hospital beds, school enrollment, and a variety of other ones. Such comparisons, I just would add, are not without complexity and without challenge, but I think it's nonetheless important to underline the broad comparison does reinforce our ideas about what works and what doesn't work in development. I think it's important, just to remember for a moment that our work in the past has generated successes. We don't often hear about them. It does require that we have some historical and institutional memory. John is one of the great institutional memories in town. We should be used often when we're talking about development issues. And I think we have to remember that you can't rebuild a nation in a day, a week, or a month. And if we're going to take this long view, we've got to look backward to learn and forward to act. And so I think this appreciation for even our own history is extremely important. So what can we learn from development practice in the spirit of what John was talking about, of implementing a program that actually takes into account what's happened in the world and how it's changed over the last 30 or 40 years? One of the things we've learned is that it's critical to build real partnerships from the start. Partnership is critical. This requires honesty and transparency in the way we approach the partnership question. It means that we also have to be willing to take risks. We can't be totally risk-averse in the way we go about this partnering. It's okay, actually, to be tough in negotiating benchmarks for performance. I think you get more respect from your partner when you're doing that. And at the end of the day, this transparency actually helps to promote good governance, something we all care about and we talk about in the development field, but oftentimes we're not acting on in the way we partner with countries and even the not-for-profit sector through our finance and programs. We've got to target critical issues. We've got to know the context. And we've got to have the tools as development professionals and the resources and flexibility to respond to the needs of the development circumstances on the ground. We've got to build local capacity. War-torn countries, be it a Bangladesh in a post-liberation war context, they need leadership and institutions. Those professionals working in those contexts at the same time must have the capacity to invest in with both creativity and speed to build the kind of institutions, infrastructure, and leadership capability that's going to be needed to rebuild those societies. Oftentimes, there's much going on and there's much in the way of human and institutional resources right under your nose, but oftentimes we don't see it because we don't go in with an appreciation for context or an appreciation of the institutional realities that are there. In many cases, NGOs have been operating in these contexts for decades, building trained staff, and oftentimes they're not necessarily tapped for their knowledge or their capacity. We've got to build for the future with an exit strategy in mind. A program in Bangladesh should be from the beginning something we think of as Bangladeshi owned and managed. Our role in these contexts is to jump in as a partner, start an initiative, provide needed capital, work to identify a means to toward generating long-term revenue to support the program, and get out. It may take 20 years in some cases to get lasting results, but we should, at the end of the day, be thinking about the fact that success is defined by our exit. In the end, it's about ownership. The reality is we as Americans need to be humble. We cannot solve all the world's problems. We may not even be able to solve the development problems of a single country, like an Afghanistan or a Pakistan. What we can do, however, is to take strategically targeted measures to help people help themselves. This means building our own development system in a comprehensive way that is capable of transferring information, capacity, and control to recipients themselves. So how do we get a system that's actually going to do that for us? The answer, I don't think, is, and I would just emphasize what John says, is we don't go back to the 1970s. It's a different world. Much has changed since then. The economies of the globe have changed. There's dense civil society. We're in the era of the information revolution. We've got to take all of these issues into account. The real answer is building a system that can understand and meet the needs of today's customers and recipients. We've got to take more of a customer and recipient approach to this, just as the private sector does. We can't be driving the agenda from Washington, from Congress, from the development institutions in this town. We have got to be thinking the way business people do, which is what do people actually need and how can we help them achieve independence and empowerment and a freestanding state and an effective civil society. To start that process, we need a national development strategy that defines the mission that we seek to pursue and establishes the core principles that are going to be employed in achieving our goals, and coordinates, as John said, the work of the various parts of the U.S. government. Right now, we don't have that strategy. We've got to ensure that our national strategy for global development is informed by things that poor people actually need. The customer perspective, again, needs to be emphasized. And we need to measure our strategy against the right kinds of benchmarks. When measuring results, we need to focus on the right results, and we need to focus on them from a field perspective. Too much of our current system is based on, frankly, bean counting and box checking. Our current measurement tools are all about reporting the kinds of results that matter to Washington. Counterintuitively, if we want real results in the field, we need to evaluate what is actually working to deliver the lasting impacts we're seeking for the poor. This will sometimes, more often than not, require ditching the evaluation measures that Washington cares about in favor of measures that are more meaningful for the actual recipients of the aid that we're providing. Again, we need to adapt a customer perspective. The second big issue that we've got to confront, and I'll be brief because I know John wants me to wrap, is that we need to transfer information, capacity, and control to recipient governments and citizens. We need to ensure that recipient governments and citizens have the information they need to use our assistance well. How can a government plan its own investments if it doesn't know what budget it's going to have going forward? How can a citizen hold their government accountable for corruption if they don't know what the revenue streams are? And how can an entrepreneur know where and how he should invest in his business if, in fact, it's unclear what the investment climate is going to be based on a lack of information? So as a first step, we need to be fulfilling our commitment to make all current data on investments available. Capacity, we need to be making the kinds of institutional investments that leave a positive, lasting legacy in the way that they have in Bangladesh. And so we need a system that has a mandate to take a long-term perspective, an institutional system that has patience. And finally, and let me just wrap up with this point, we need to deal with the control dilemma. We need to be able to let go a little bit. Our job should be, in effect, ideally, our work should be focused on working our way out of a job. This approach can actually be somewhat terrifying to those of us here in Washington who actually have the responsibility for stewarding the taxpayers' dollars. However, the paradox here is loosening our grip and sharing responsibility through effective partnerships is precisely what's going to get us success. So you've got to figure out what's the right balance between the kind of control and stewardship we need to exercise and how we can effectively let go to enable ownership to happen. Let me close by simply saying I think it's terrific that Chairman Berman's bill is on the floor. Our hope is that it embodies many of the principles I've described, and we hope we can count on all of your support in representing some of these principles as this reform debate advances. Thank you very much, and apologies, John, for my excess. Really good.
Turn this over to Diana Olbaum.
I'm short enough that I can't see you all from sitting down, so I thought I'd stand up here to give my remarks and also give Ray a chance to actually eat his lunch. So thank you so much, John, for your introduction, and to the Wilson Center for inviting me here today. I think you've got a great series of programs here, and if the attendance here is any evidence, this is something that's needed and important, and we appreciate your hosting it. It's also an honor for me to be on the panel here with Ray Offenhauser, who's been really a leader in the calls for foreign aid reform and modernization, and the work that his organization is doing on the ground not only helps so many millions of poor people around the world, but the information and the experience that he brings from that will really help us inform the debate. I don't know if anybody mentioned this at the outset, but I do need to say that my comments are off the record, despite them being filmed. I don't know how that works. Well, I'll say they reflect only my personal views and not necessarily those of Chairman Berman. So what I'd like to address today is some of the reasons why foreign aid reform has failed in the past, and why I think that's changed and will be successful this time around. I think probably everyone here can agree that modernization of our foreign aid laws is something that's necessary. As you all know, the existing law that forms the foundation of our foreign aid was written in 1961. Of course, it's been updated and amended many times since then, but never in any coordinated, cohesive, comprehensive way. And so what we're left with is a patchwork of authorities and prohibitions that sometimes are conflicting or contradictory and don't really hold together as the basis of our foreign aid program. They don't always provide a clear sense of goals and objectives. As just a few of you may remember, I was part of the last attempt to rewrite the Foreign Assistance Act back in 1993 and 94. It was the end of the Cold War, and we thought at that time it was high time to adjust our foreign aid laws to reflect the new realities of of the world, and the Clinton administration actually put together a draft bill, and we began our work on it here in Congress. But it turned out to be not as easy as anyone, well, no one thought it would be easy, but it was even harder than we imagined. The bill that the Clinton administration put together gave them lots of flexibility, but didn't give Congress much oversight. It had a new and slimmed down list of priorities, but reducing poverty wasn't one of them. And it became clear that no matter what we did, we were going to run up against issues relating to family planning and abortion, and that was going to pose a major obstacle to passage. And then many of you may remember what happened in November of 1994. The Democrats lost control of both the House and the Senate. And at that point, there was no appetite, I think, in the administration and among Democrats for moving a bill that would simply become a tool for partisan wrangling. The lesson that I took from that experience was that timing is everything. And we were actually ready to move ahead with a reform bill in 1993, in the first year of the Clinton administration. In Congress, we were ready, but we decided to wait for the administration to submit its own bill. And by the time that process worked its way through, it was already well into 1994. By the time we had hearings and markups and everything, it was well into an election year. And the lesson is that you can't do foreign aid reform in an election year. The second problem that we had last time was that foreign aid was perceived, and this may still be the case, but as highly unpopular among the American public. And especially with the end of the Cold War, everyone was looking for a so-called peace dividend. And for some people, that meant cutting foreign aid. And for many people, the whole rationale for doing foreign aid was gone once there wasn't a communist menace to deal with. And I think you can see the results of that, or the proof of that, in the breakdown of the authorizing process. There hasn't been a regular foreign aid authorization bill enacted since 1985. And I think that's in large measure because members of Congress didn't want to vote twice for foreign aid, once in the authorization and once in the appropriations bill each year. A third reason that we had trouble with foreign aid reform in the past was that there was no real movement to speak of for foreign aid reform. Yes, there were groups calling for it, but they weren't very organized or very powerful. And frankly, some of them continued to push for their own earmarks and their own interests in the bill at the same time, so there were some countervailing pressures. It wasn't a case where organizations put the needs of the whole before their own. And as a result of that, there were elected officials didn't really feel that there would be any downside, any serious political penalty for holding up a foreign aid reform bill. In fact, they often had more to gain by standing firm in support of a particular political objective than to lose by holding up the whole bill. So what has changed? First of all, I think we have the advantage of hindsight in knowing that we need to move quickly to take advantage of this unique window of opportunity. And by that, I don't want to suggest that this will be a bill that we push through over Republican objections. We're seeking to put together a bipartisan bill that has broad support on both sides of the aisle and in the administration. But there are always going to be tensions and differences between the executive and legislative branches. That's just a part of the system of checks and balances. But when you can take the partisan aspect out of the traditional congressional executive tension, that makes things much, much easier to pass. The second thing I think has changed is the general attitude towards foreign assistance. Over the past 15 years, I think there's really been a noticeable change. Yes, there's still a shocking degree of ignorance among the general public about foreign aid. Most of them still believe that we spend 15 or 20% of our budget on foreign aid, and they see it as cash transfers to corrupt governments. They don't realize what foreign aid really is. But I think what has changed is that there's a realization that what happens in the rest of the world affects us directly. I think people understand that what young boys are learning in madrasas in Pakistan, or the new strains of flu that originate in a pig farm in Mexico or Mongolia, depending on what you believe, or tropical forests that are being cut down, really come back and have a meaningful impact on us here in the United States. And I think after the experiences of Iraq and Afghanistan, the American public is coming to understand the importance of the second two Ds, development and diplomacy, alongside the first D of defense. And if we're going to be able to extract our troops from harm's way and to prevent them from being sent there in the first place, we're really going to have to spend more time, attention, and resources on diplomacy and development. The third change is that I think we're now witnessing the creation of a very diverse and broad-based coalition that is dedicated to the larger goal of foreign assistance modernization and reform. Ray Offenhauser is playing a major role in leading a group called the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network. Oxfam has been producing extremely helpful reports and materials to help move the process forward. I think a lot of you have probably been hearing from your constituents. Bread for the World, I know, just had a major Hill Day where they sent hundreds of people around. And even though Bread for the World is an organization that focuses on hunger, they had made Chairman Berman's bill, H.R. 2139, the Initiating Foreign Assistance Reform Bill, their first legislative priority of the year. And to have, grassroots lobbying for something as kind of obscure as foreign aid reform is a major, major change and important undertaking. And so I guess I'll take the opportunity to make a little plug for the bill. If there's been any confusion, it hasn't moved yet. It's still before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and we are actively seeking co-sponsors. I think equally important to the changes I just mentioned about Americans being more cognizant of the ways the rest of the world affects them and the development of this outside NGO coalition is that we have now a large number of conservatives and Republicans who in the past may have been more skeptical or even hostile to certain foreign aid programs, who have identified various elements that they feel very strongly about, whether it's the Water for the World Act, PEPFAR, microenterprise, child survival. So there's a real feeling that this is now a bipartisan enterprise, and it's not just Democrats pushing for it, but there's a much more bipartisan feel. So I would say that these developments all give me hope that things will be different this time around. I do think that the key will be coming up with actual legislation that balances the administration's desire for greater flexibility with the congressional desire for greater accountability and oversight, and at the same time creating a system that seeks to address quickly and reliably the needs of the poor people around the world and helps them address the many challenges that they face. So that's my task on the Foreign Affairs Committee to help draft this legislation, and I look forward to working with all of you as we move the process forward. Thank you.
Thank you both. Those were succinct. They could have gone on, and I would have gotten even more out of it than I did, so thank you. The floor is open. This is your session to ask any questions you want. Raise your hands. I'll try and recognize everybody. If you would be relatively brief in deference to the rest of your colleagues, and please tell us who you are when you stand up. Who wants the first question?
I'll
Oh, we have a mic. Good.
Mark. Okay, Mark Gage, Foreign Affairs Committee. I just was interested, Mr. Offenhauser, when you said Washington wants to set goals. And I think a lot of times for the average person, that means the U.S. government. That means the Congress, the executive branch. To be frank about it, sometimes it seems that the implementers, NGOs and other organizations actually do the foreign aid implementation in the field, also want to lay on these processes their goals. And you, in your argument, say, let's let the recipients, the customers, the host governments, the people that need it, really tell us what they need. And I just would like to ask, when you say Washington, do you mean that broadly? Do you mean just the government, or do you mean that to include people who have good intentions, but maybe trying to overmanage or micromanage here from D.C. and kind of thwart what you're driving at? Thank you.
Go ahead, Ray. Because it's an important question.
Well, I think actually our government has certainly every right to have a sort of strategic perspective on how it wants to approach this whole issue of foreign assistance, and how it wants to address, beyond the foreign assistance question, the broader issue of development, which is a more all-encompassing concept. And one of the things at Oxfam we're arguing for is actually thinking beyond the traditional sort of more narrow scope of our sort of Usaid agenda, and thinking about how our aid agenda, our trade agenda, and even issues like climate change actually interact with one another on the ground in many of these countries, so that our strategic, as we think about a whole approach to this that's a national development strategy, we're actually thinking about a whole of government approach and an integrated approach that's way beyond the way we've thought in the past. So when I'm talking about a 21st century vision from the U.S. government and from a strategy point of view, I'm talking about big picture that's beyond sort of maybe the specific sort of foreign policy goals of the State Department in a particular context. So, you know, maybe just to kind of make that point. I guess the spirit of what I'm trying to say about the process itself and the way we discharge the actual discipline or a development practice per se is that I think we've learned over the years that we've got to move from an approach in which we are the knowledge purveyors and the operational implementers to a place where we are really working toward creating leadership, building institutions, and where it's appropriate, investing in infrastructure. And I think many of the development professionals, who may be scattered about this room, or certainly, who inhabit this town, who find themselves in countries who are charged with implementing our development programs, oftentimes when they hit the ground, the first thing they're trying to figure out is who's a real leader in this country? What institutions actually work? Where can I make an investment that's going to pay off for the people of this country? And in the absence of those leaders or those institutions or that infrastructure, your work is really hard. And what I think we've got to begin to do is actually, and historically we've actually, interestingly enough, we've done this work before. We have invested in this kind of leadership development handsomely. And when many of us have arrived in these countries, we've actually met the leaders that have benefited from U.S. education or training or one thing or another. And we've met or we've worked with the agrarian universities in these countries that have been partnered with the Cornells and the Texas Techs and so forth. So there is the idea for mutual learning and partnership between U.S. institutions and institutions in these countries. I think there's ample opportunity for that. But the piece I think that's really critically important is we've got to get to a place where we don't assume that the process and our engagement as sort of leaders and implementers is something that is inevitable and interminable. That we really need to be working toward an exit strategy. We really need to be working toward a handover. And we need to be, in effect, working with our partners in these countries as co-institutional strategists and thinking about, how do we get a new educational institution jump-started up and off the ground that's going to produce people who work in the public policy sphere, or an agricultural university in a province of a country that desperately needs one. This kind of hardcore institutional work that's the stuff of real development takes time. It takes certain kinds of disciplines and a high degree of professionalism and real commitment on the part of our government. And it's not short-term, quick hit, in and out, work. It's a roll-up-your-sleeves kind of job.
I'll give you an example of what Ray was saying. 1954, the Korean War ended. Korea looked like Baghdad did after the invasion. Started receiving very large infusions of Usaid. By roughly the beginning of 1960, the Koreans were told that they would, in 10 years, they'd be off aid, and they'd be on their own. And Usaid ended in that point in time. So that's roughly 14 years or so. Egypt's been a large recipient of Usaid since 1979, and with the goal towards achieving peace in the Middle East. And I would ask whether that is an extremely long time for any country to receive large amounts of anybody's aid without entering into a dependency relationship, which is basically not very productive. More questions? Against the wall here, sir.
I'm Adam Graham Silverman with CQ. I was curious if you could speak a little bit more about the executive-legislative relationship and how that might be working differently than it has during the Clinton administration or other times. They haven't been that obliging in that we don't have an AID head. They haven't, at least publicly, said much about the structure that they're looking for of the aid agencies. How is that working so far? What do you need to hear from them? And at what point do you need to move forward, with or without them to, as you said, move quickly on?
Let me give you a quick reaction to that. But if Diana wants to respond, bear in mind her remarks are her own and off the record. Okay, particularly as you're writing. I think the impetus that Ray mentioned and others for a national development strategy is to get an agreement among the executive and the Congress. With lots of input from the outside on what are our goals and objectives, and how do we make the kinds of judgments that Ray referred to, and that's why it's critically important, in my personal view, that there be a national development strategy, whether it's formally called that, like the national security strategy, or whether it achieves the same purposes. But do you want to respond?
Sure. I think Adam raises an important question because. It actually formed the crux of one of my points about timing. Last time we did wait for the administration to come up with its own proposal, and unfortunately we ran into a situation where it was an election year and so forth. So that's why we feel it's important to move forward quickly now and get the issues on the table. But it's not going to work if we have to force the administration into structural changes that they can't live with, and it's not our intention to try to use this as a cudgel. However, focusing attention on these difficult issues in a new administration is always hard, and especially when all the appropriate players are not yet in place. So we're just looking at this as the only way to move this process forward is to come up with a proposal, and hopefully it will be easier for them to react to it and respond to it and work with it than to have the task of developing the proposal from the first place. So our idea is to come up with a plan and then let them respond to it, and hopefully within the next couple of months all the appropriate people will be in place.
By the way, I've been reminded that this session is meant primarily for congressional staff people with outside guests. Your outside guests are welcome to speak up, but priority will be given to congressional staff. So in that, over in the corner.
I'm Hera Abbasi from Congressman Jerry Connolly's office. Diana, you mentioned the last time in '93 or '94 when you tried to, pass the foreign aid bill, that there were some issues with, family planning, women's issues, that we encounter over and over again. And with the recent passage of the Foreign Affairs authorization, there was some issue with the Global Women's Office, and we had to put the committee had to put some language in, while it was on the floor, essentially, in a manager's amendment. How strategically can the committee, sort of rally bipartisan support, as you mentioned, for this bill when this is such a huge issue, just for even many members of the Democratic caucus who are just freshmen and sophomore members, not even talking about the Republican conference? How do we approach it strategically?
Well, I don't think this issue's really gotten any easier than it's been last time. I mean, all the same issues that were facing the Senate when I started in '84 and '85, Mexico City, UNFPA, are still with us. And the pendulum swings from one side to the other. It's kind of the other direction now, but not so far in any direction that there's a clear majority that can be taken for granted. So what we're relying on is that we'll be able to find some accommodation that all sides can live with, and that in any event the politics of holding a foreign aid reform bill hostage to that issue have changed, and so that there will be a political penalty for preventing our foreign aid system from becoming more effective and more modernized because you don't like what the outcome was on one issue.
Good. Here? So from congressional staff, gentleman here. In the back. Are you on the congressional staff? Huh? You're working in Congress? No. No? Okay. No? Okay, good. Go ahead. You've been waiting. Go ahead. My masters are telling me what I should do. So
Thank you, and I appreciate that. I'm John McCormick with the Energy Policy Center. And Ray, you've given us a very succinct roadmap for reauthorization of foreign assistance, and you did mention the words climate change. Would that your views could have been adopted by the Congress in 1961 when carbon dioxide was, 310 parts per million. Now it's 390 parts per million. Your mention of Bangladesh is, it's almost, one could say, in 50 years, it's possibly an epitaph and not long-term organization. Appreciating the work that Oxfam is doing on trying to broadcast the issue of climate change, could you imagine perhaps the Berman bill having an entire chapter on how we're going to look at climate change and how foreign assistance will be playing into that?
good question.
Well, for us, I think, thanks very much for the question, first of all. I think for us, the climate change is one of the big development challenges for our generation. Let me just put it that succinctly. So for Oxfam as an organization and many of our sister organizations, we see this as both a challenge and an opportunity, because we think that we need to be looking at climate change not as, exclusively as a sort of a standalone siloed issue, but we actually need to be thinking about it as it affects agricultural systems in developing countries, as it affects vulnerable populations, as it can impact and cause climate-related migration in countries. And you mentioned Bangladesh. I was the head of the Ford office there for 5 years and actually funded the first climate change assessment of Bangladesh in 1992 of potential impacts. And so we were looking at all of these issues. And interestingly enough, I would just add on the Bangladesh case right now, it's probably one of the leading countries in the world in terms of providing conceptual leadership on adaptation and impacts of climate change on developing countries. Whether, in fact, we should mix the climate change agenda into this aid reform legislative process, I think is, to some degree, for those of you who are more, tuned into the sort of legislative process than I am, it may be helpful to the climate change issue. It may not be helpful to the aid reform process, which is complicated enough as it is. I mean, just to build a little bit on John's opening, the Kennedy administration and its bill was a 250-page document, very sharp, very succinct, very visionary, and offered a very powerful strategy and forward-looking vision for the country at that particular time, basically projecting American values in particular areas, launching 4 critical institutions, not trying to define all the program areas or earmarks or everything else. It was a big vision document. Subsequently, we've produced something like 2,500 additional pieces of paper or pages to kind of qualify that. I think as we look for this reform bill going forward, I think we need to figure out, again, taking the high road, the principled road, what are the critical issues and problems in our current system that are broken, that need to be fixed, and focus on those issues front and center in terms of the way we're reconstructing the system. And then once we've got that, those pieces in place, one of which is the National Development Strategy, having that strategy, then I think we can turn our attention to some of the issues that many of us work on and care about very deeply: agriculture, climate change, global health, and so on and so forth. So those of us that have been part of the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network, one of the agreements we made when we got into this, even though all of us represent, all of us work on all of these sectoral questions, was the most important thing for us to work on in the short term is reforming the overall system. We got to take the high road. We can't be parochial. So I'm not saying climate change is a parochial issue by any stretch. My organization is deeply involved on a global level on this issue. But I think we've got to see this reform issue as so important for our generation and so important in this political moment that we've got to take full advantage of the fact that we've got congressional interest and tremendous leadership on both the House and Senate side. We've got social movements with the One Campaign, Oxfam, Bread for the World, environmental organizations, other groups from the health community mobilizing their grassroots base to support your legislators in their work in support of this bill. This is a movement we have not had before in this effort. I've been through 3 of these exercises along with Diana, so I'm a bit of a veteran too of these wars, and I'm very excited and enthusiastic and optimistic because I think the political support on the ground in your districts is out there. And we want to make that happen this time, and we want to mobilize that support and bring it home and get a real reform bill. So yes to climate change as an important development issue and part of the way we think about whole-of-government approaches to development down the road. But first step is let's get the system reformed. We've got to rebuild civilian capacity. We've got to get the budgets up. We've got to rebuild AID from the ground up and get the number of FTEs to the right place. And then we're going to start working on those very important sectoral issues.
But that's why you need a whole government approach, because right now the people negotiating Kyoto are either lawyers or climatologists, and there are no development people in that debate when the meeting opens in Copenhagen at the end of the month, and large amounts of money are going to be allocated for adaptation and mitigation. So, you got a second question?
Yeah, I would like to ask this, and it sounds maybe like maybe a stupid question. But then again, I've been known to ask stupid questions. How do we define development? Where is it defined in the law? Is it actually, I have not myself, and there are experts in the room, I've not looked, but I haven't seen it defined in the 61 Act, but I may have missed it. And the reason I ask that is that it seems that it's kind of an elastic concept that can end up covering everything, or it can cover helping people get enough food or getting out of poverty. But is it a process? Is it a set of objectives? And the reason that I think it may be an important question, hopefully not a stupid one, is that everybody knows development when they see it. But how do you define it? And I think when we talk about a strategy, it seems that maybe this is something that could be addressed. If it's been addressed, forgive me, I haven't yet seen it, but that's the question.
Let me make a brief remark and then turn to the panelists. I think the way to approach this issue is looking at major global problems. Economic growth is one of them. Now, economic growth happens to be something that, in promoting economic growth, that there's pretty general agreement is we don't know how to do it. We know countries have done it, and we know how individual countries do it, but if you're sitting from the outside, most of the nostrums for promoting growth over the last 20 years have failed abysmally. But we do know a great deal and can quantify it about health, about education, about dealing with the HIV/AIDS crisis, about improving women's education, or any number of issues. And it seems to me you have to have, I don't know how you do it in legislation because I'm a non-profit person and we don't get involved in political issues. But there's a way to write this into the bill which I haven't looked at the 1961 Act in a long time, but they were in the beginning of the Act in one way or another in quite a different ways. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, thank you, Mark, for that question, because I think that what we're really trying to do here is be very, very clear about what our goals and objectives are for foreign assistance. And using a word like development as an objective doesn't work for the very reason you say, because people have different ideas of what development means and how it's done. And so rather than just saying, you know, our goal is development, we're going to talk about very specific goals and priorities and objectives, whether, you know, they're in specific areas like food security or, you know, generating jobs and income or, you know, health, whatever it is. Those specific objectives will be written there so that we're not talking in abstract terminology, but being very clear about what we're trying to achieve.
You had a quick question.
Can I take a shot at that one, John? Just
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
maybe just on the development question,
Right.
just to offer a quick, you know, and I'm going to offer this as an Oxfam perspective, and you know, based on kind of what we've learned over the years, we've come to believe that effective development outcomes really are about sort of three fundamental things: improving sort of active citizenship and institutionalizing ways in which citizens can be engaged in their societies, which gets to the heart of the governance conundrum that we talk a lot about. Effective states, and I think to some degree in our discussions over the years, the value of the state and the role of the state has been to some degree devalued, and I think we need to revisit that, you know, and understand it more profoundly. And finally, the whole issue of markets and inclusive markets that will enable the markets to unleash the power that they could potentially deliver to alleviating poverty around the world. For us, those are sort of the three kind of critical ingredients, and then I think if you take those and you translate them into very specific sort of sectoral areas and metrics, you can come up with a meaningful way of seeing the process with some degree of clarity and incorporate it into a strategy.
Let me just say that for the U.S. government, which is still the biggest donor and has great strength both in government and in our private sector, both profit-making and nonprofit, it's possible to do both. It's both possible to talk about a top-down approach, I'll call it that to use the jargon, where you spend a lot of effort building the capacity of government. No country has grown or diminished poverty without having an effective government. No, I didn't say democratic, I said effective. But it's also possible at the same time to think about programs that deal with the kind of issues that Ray just talked about. And it's not an either-or proposition. You need both. And it should not be beyond the wit of this country to be able to design those kinds of programs. Sir, you've been patiently waiting. No, I'm a gentleman here. Yeah.
Grant Morrill, USAID, in the Office of the Administrator. And my questions represent my personal line of inquiry as well. I agree. I greatly appreciated your analysis, Ms. Obama, of the reasons why this can work now. It represents a win-win proposition for the American people, Congress, and the executive. So we look towards the obstacles of what's keeping it from happening. And I think one that I wanted to ask about was the balance between congressional oversight and executive flexibility. And do you have any ideas on how that compromise can be struck?
Various organizations in their analyses of the foreign aid reform process have talked about this idea called a grand bargain, where all the sides have to kind of sit down in a room together and decide, you know, what their bottom line is, what they need and what they can give up. And at some point during this process, that's just going to have to happen. We're going to have to look at things from a different standpoint, whereas Congress is accustomed to doing its oversight by controlling how things are accomplished, how much money goes to which programs. We're going to have to start shifting to measuring our oversight by how well goals and objectives have been accomplished. and holding the administration to its goals. Well, we may set the overall goals, but then the idea would be that we have to hold the administration to achieving them, as opposed to directing how everything is done. That's going to be a very difficult process. That's not how we're used to conducting business here. But at some point, if we're going to really reform the way foreign assistance works and not just change the number on the bill, that kind of grand bargain is going to have to be struck.
Ray, let me follow up on that for you. It seems to me that it's going to pose, this kind of thing is going to pose problems for NGOs, for civil society, because the previous practice over decades now is to get an earmark. You get an earmark for women, you get an earmark for microfinance, and so on and so forth. If you're going to have the kind of aid program you need, development program you're going to need, there's going to have to be a self-denying ordinance on the part of lots of people to make sure that although, and they have to be reassured that their issue is going to be taken into account without strangling the people who are trying to run a program. You want to react? Or?
Yeah. Well, I think this has been a conversation that's been going on in the NGO community for the last several months, and there's been outreach to a variety of different institutional actors across all sorts of sectors, from the MFAN group, and there's conversations going on within the different sectoral groups. I think, again, what we've tried to do is give primacy to the reform process itself, because we think that is in the national interest. And paradoxically, I think, to John's point, many of the organizations who, in the international not-for-profit sector here in the United States and the contracting community and so forth, we've adapted our behavior to the system that we have been given. And I guess the counter, I guess, coming from our community has been, we're willing to explore a different way of doing business, but we need to see leadership from within the Congress and from the executive branch to offer us a new framework. And we're just simply there doing what is appropriate to the missions of our organization. But if there were new rules and a new approach and a bold new strategy for how this works, we have to assume that health is going to be a part of that. We have to assume that governance is going to be a part of that. We have to assume that food security is going to be a part of that. We have to assume that climate change and environmental security is going to be a part of that. So we're probably going to be there, a part of whatever vision emerges anyway. We just have to be patient enough and believe that actually a better system is going to serve U.S. interests as well as be in the best interests of the missions of our organizations. And that's that's the conversation we've been having within our own community to try to get everyone on board behind a kind of a big picture vision for reform.
I think it's fair to say, I can speak for Diana, I think she's got a little bit more time, and I hope Ray does. We're happy to answer questions. You may have to go to work. So if you want to slip out, feel free to do so, and we'll run it for a few more questions. Gentleman in the back there.
I'm Sung Kim from U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and I do not speak for my organization. This is my personal views. In advocating for international religious freedom, USERF advises the President, the Congress, and the Secretary of State on how to go about with foreign policy on different countries. And of course, international religious freedom is an aspect of international development. And in doing so, there's that sort of controversy that there's foreign policy versus foreign aid. And there's sort of this utility that the government can have in terms of using aid as a foreign policy. And I was wondering, in bringing about the sort of goals and objective and the real changes that you were talking about, is the legislative reform going to have an outline of some sort that says, in trying to bring about real changes and meeting the real objectives that we want to meet, that there's going to be restriction on some sort of utility that the aid may have?
Okay,
by
good
foreign
question.
policy?
Want to respond? Either of you?
I think it's important for everybody to keep in mind that the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, as well as the reform bill that we're working on, doesn't cover just development assistance. It's all kinds of, human rights and democracy, military and security assistance, counter-narcotics, the whole range. And so there will have to be goals and objectives for each of the different types of assistance, and for all, our goals aren't just development. They also include human rights, democracy, and so forth. And so, we'll be dealing with those issues as well, and not trying to force it all under the development kind of threshold.
I think people are now having to face the strictures of their office, so let's end the official session now. I, at least, and I don't know if my colleagues speak for themselves, are perfectly happy to talk with people afterwards and answer some of the questions that I didn't have a chance to recognize. I want to thank you all for coming. Many of us stand ready to answer questions if you have them. There's at least two people in the room, George Ingram on my right, who has been involved in these issues almost as long as I have, and the gentleman on my left, Larry Knowles, who was the chief person on the Congressional Research Service, knows more history than I do. And if you want to know why aid reform failed before, Larry has a marvelous chapter in a book that will tell you all about it. So I thank you all for being here, and I particularly want to thank the staff of Wilson Center on the Hill for doing this. It was very good.